Very special thanks to Cars of Somerset for providing the Nissan GTR in this review, and of course if you want to check out the specs on this car, if it is still for sale, or any of the numerous aftermarket modifications done to it, or of course check out their other stock, or potentially even get them to source you a car within the UK, then of course you can find all of those details by clicking the link right below this video in the description. The last time that I drove a Nissan GTR was unsurprisingly in this same series, and it was actually the facelifted one, what I like to call the R35.2. That car was at the time the fastest car I'd ever driven, a Litchfield-tuned 650 horsepower GTR, with a sub 3 second 0 to 60 time, and I described it as addictively terrifying. And of course, if you want to check out that review for the GTR, you can click the link at the top of the screen here. Now this one, as I alluded to in that review, is actually the one that I like more. I like the earlier R35, that initial shape, more than the newer ones. And there are actually a couple of reasons why. In fact, there are three primary reasons, and I think that these three reasons may be worth your attention. Now, there's not that much to be said about a vehicle like the GTR that hasn't already been said by somebody else. And that's actually one of my points. Because as I mentioned recently in my review for the Bentley Continental GT, that car, this car, and the Bugatti Veyron are at least three examples of vehicles that have been around for so long, or at least in the case of the Veyron, were around for so long, with updates, facelifts, special editions, etc., that people became over-familiar with them, and what was remarkable to begin with became expected, and people had that familiarity breeds contempt about these cars. In the case of the GTR though, I would actually argue that has happened even more than the Bentley and the Veyron, because those are still exotics in a more traditional sense, whereas this, it almost feels like the ultimate possible tuner car. It has a more affordable price compared to many exotics. It has more of a almost like import style interior that you'd expect from like a 90s Skyline or a Supra, of course quite deliberately. The heads-up display was even designed by Polyphony Digital, makers of Gran Turismo, and the car is a completely digital answer to many of the European or even American analog examples of a performance car. Corvettes, Vipers, and then the more technical side, Porsche 911s, etc. However, when this car first burst onto the scene in around 2007, at a similar time to the Audi R8, this thing just destroyed everything. And I don't even care if you're not a fan of the GTR, you cannot deny that. The GTR in 2007 was a pivot point in automotive history. I would actually argue more so than the Bugatti Veyron was. I believe, and this is quite the argument to stand behind, but I think you can justify it, I think that the Nissan GTR is actually the most significant performance car since the McLaren F1. Because, unlike the McLaren, which essentially was just what the Veyron was proving all over again, this was not the ultimate car in every sense, a no expense spared ultimate hypercar. This was the total opposite end of the spectrum. This was a vehicle with that kind of ability, but for a fraction of the price, that could be mass-produced and was far more attainable and far more useful. Now, I am, contrary to what you might think, not necessarily an absolutely in-love person with the Nissan GTR. In fact, I probably wouldn't buy one myself. But that's the thing. Much like the Porsche 911, I can have a huge amount of respect for something, even if I wouldn't necessarily want to own one myself. And that's exactly the case with the GTR. And another reason why I actually like this first generation more than the newer ones is actually because of what it could do compared to what it has to work with. Because with those facelifts and updates, even up until today, including Nismos, Spec Vs, etc., well, of course they're going to get quicker. That's the whole point. Because unlike a lot of cars, the GTR wasn't really facelifted to sort out major reliability issues or fix inherent problems. It was just, much like the Porsche 911, evolving an already brilliant idea. The thing is though, those later cars, as I said, of course are going to get quicker and quicker. That's the whole point of refining the process. But with that being said, let's take a look back in time, put yourself in that 2007 mindset, and just remember for a second what we felt like when that first GTR came out and when we first heard what it could do. A 3.8 litre twin-turbo V6 engine. Sure, impressively engineered, only 5 people in the world build them, but still, it's not exactly like a Lamborghini V10 or a Porsche Flat 6 or a Ferrari V8 in terms of being appealing on paper, and yet look at what it had to work with. 480 horsepower, which is about the same as a 911 Turbo of the time, not as powerful as a Gallardo, not as powerful as an F430, nowhere near as powerful as something like a Viper or even a Jag XKR from a couple of years later in its 5-litre form. Yet, look at what it could do with that. Despite the fact that it was physically large, weighed 1,740 kilos, which is over 3,800 pounds, this thing could do 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds and had a top speed of 193 miles an hour. Plus, before it was even on sale, it beat the Porsche 911 Turbo's Nürburgring lap record. This is serious territory. Again, from a 60 grand car. People rave nowadays about the C8 Corvette being around 60 grand. How on earth can Chevy afford to do that? Making a Corvette 60 grand is nothing compared to making this thing 60 grand due to the sheer amount of engineering and tech put into this car. This is far more of an impressive feat, and that comes from a huge fan of Corvettes. In fact, I would probably choose a Corvette over a GTR, but even I would unequivocally say that this is an engineering marvel, and to me that is why it's more impressive in this initial form. Sure, the later ones are quicker, but even this first car, the way it just burst onto the scene after so long since we'd had an R34 GTR Skyline, and it just upped the game to such a ridiculous degree, making a massive jump from what the Skylines could do, at least stock, to what this thing could do. All the while offering phenomenal levels of grip, the aforementioned affordability, the kind of reliability which you never find in Italian or even most other European exotics, and also with such a forgiving approach to performance that it can basically make anyone a fast driver. It has its limits, of course, and there are plenty of crashed GTRs out there, but you know what I'm talking about. It's a car which single-handedly managed to topple the Porsche 911, turbo or otherwise, as being arguably the ultimate all-round sports car. All of these things are so easy to take for granted because the GTR has been around for so long, but then when you factor in now, over a decade later, you can buy one of these for 30 grand. We're talking about a car which is faster than most $250,000, $500,000, $1 million supercars around a track, even with no modifications whatsoever, for a fraction of the cost of what it was when it was new. And even brand new, it wasn't that expensive to begin with. One of the other reasons why I have so much respect for this car, especially this first generation, is to me, this is very much so an automotive pivot point in history. Almost like the concept of BCE and AD in the years of our timeline. I would call this kind of like the before GTR and after GTR. Because if you compare the idea of what made an ultimate performance car before 2007 to after 2007, you can fairly obviously, to anyone I think who is open-minded about it, see the clear inspiration that the GTR had on every other manufacturer who makes anything close to this kind of car. Everyone had to up their game because this car jumped light years ahead of what was being done at the time. There were other fast cars, there were other forgiving cars, there were even other affordable ones, even a Corvette of the time. This one could do everything. It didn't have the passion of a Maserati or the build finish of a Bentley, but for the most part it ticked every box that you could realistically want. Now, one of the things which the GTR commonly gets criticised for is a lack of personality, and even as I just mentioned, it doesn't have the charisma of something like a Maserati or an Alfa Romeo. That's unequivocal. But here's the thing, it's not trying to. Now, the fact that Japan can have a lot of charisma is proven by vehicles such as the Lexus LFA. They can do passion when they want to. This is just not one of those times. This is designed to be the absolute weapon of the sports car world, and that's exactly what it is, and what it still is. A stock 2007 GTR can wipe the floor with most cars on sale brand new today. But with that being said, if you were going to buy one of these and use it, for example, as your daily driver, or even just as a toy, what should you be looking out for? What kind of prices should you expect? Are there any common problems, maybe that the facelift dealt with or improved on? Well, in terms of pricing, these earlier cars, this one's a 2010 for example, so it's not the oldest of the old, but generally speaking, you're looking at about £30,000 here in the UK as your entry point. You will occasionally find one for less, but even then not much. You're looking 28, 29,000, so around 30. And on the upper end of the spectrum, because so many of these cars were modified, prices can easily go well beyond 50, 60, even £70,000 for a pre-tuned, say 800 to 1000 horsepower model. So of course that's down to you. I would have thought that most people who would want something like that would want to kind of tune it themselves and oversee all of the parts fitted. You know, that's kind of part of the fun. But sure, I guess some people might want to have it ready built for them, such as the one that I was driving here. In terms of issues though, that's the great thing about the GTR. It's such a well-made, solidly developed and brilliantly engineered machine that it doesn't really have too many ongoing issues. Most of the things that you'll want to look out for, especially on older cars, because of course they're older, they have higher mileage, many of them have been tuned or track dated, etc. In particular, the transmission housing can have a distinct rattling noise while driving, and that is basically the only common fault which these seem to suffer from. But overall, there's nothing particularly major about them. The engines are bulletproof. If there's gonna be issues, it will be transmission related, but even then, these are such solid cars. The downside is that if you want to keep one well serviced, and of course with an older car that shouldn't be as much of an issue, but if you do want to, they are expensive to run. Nitrogen-filled tyres, servicing is expensive, they are expensive cars, but again, for this calibre of performance, that's kind of what you should expect. So they are by no means as cheap as something like a Jag XKR to keep on the road, but again, if you're willing to pay this kind of money for one, well, chances are it's going to be your baby, so you probably won't care too much. This is the kind of car that people would have dreamed of owning as they grew up. So I think most people who want a GTR probably aren't going to be too bothered by that. Now, in terms of practicality, one of the very few issues that I had in that other review of the facelifted car was really surprising to me, and that was the space. See, for such a large vehicle, a vehicle which Nissan themselves have confirmed was inspired by Gundam, and interestingly was partially designed by Nissan US and partially designed by Nissan Europe in terms of different aspects of its design, you would think that such a big car, which some would still nickname Godzilla, would have a lot of interior space. It is a 2+2 seater after all, but that's the thing, it's not as big inside as you would assume. Now I will say this one felt a little bit better than that facelifted car in terms of headroom, legroom, etc., but there's not as much space as I would have thought. The rear seats aren't the most spacious, but they're good enough for kids, and the trunk space is, you know, about adequate for a GT car anyway, so you could certainly use one every day if you wanted to, but for a bigger driver like myself, you might find the car a little bit more cramped than you're expecting to. Much like the newer car though, that's essentially my only critique. For me personally, I do tend to prefer cars that have more passion and charisma with a little bit of more oddball flair to them. I mean, I drive a Maserati for a reason. On paper, of course, this would wipe the floor with my car, but honestly, I prefer driving my car. The GTR is a specific taste. As I said earlier, it's a weapon. It's designed to be the ultimate performance machine, not the ultimate passion machine or the ultimate charisma machine. If that doesn't bother you, then I don't think anything will disappoint you about the car, because it does everything you'd expect it to do. If you're looking for a more passionate experience, well then you might want to look more down the route of something like maybe a Porsche 911, maybe an Alfa Giulia Quadrifoglio, maybe even something like a Maserati, or an Aston. I do get the distinct impression though that for most people who buy GTRs, they probably just wanted a GTR. It's not the kind of car that really has that many direct rivals anyway, especially at the time, so if you do want one, there's plenty to love. So if you do own a GTR, could be this one, could be a newer one, or if you used to, of course drop your stories down below, maybe even some warnings for potential owners, things to look out for or expect from the ownership experience. And of course if you're a fan of the channel and just like talking about cars as I do, then of course drop your thoughts down there as well. But if you want to check out the other GTR review, you can do so by clicking through to the playlist here, where you can see all episodes of Beards and Cars. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.